Hello everyone. Now, I recently made a tier 10 destroyer comparison vid, and it was very well received. People enjoyed it a lot because it helped them decide which tier 10 they wanted to go for themselves, and it helped them plan ahead which kind of playstyle they enjoyed and which they didn't. So, of course, people requested I do this for the other lines, so I'm gonna follow it up with the tier 10 Cruiser comparison. Now the Cruisers are kind of in the same situation that the DDs are, that there's really no single best cruiser in the game. They're simply cruisers that are excellent at some parts and have other weaknesses in return. And the first one I will start with is, of course, the Zao. The Zao is probably the single most popular cruiser in the game. That's mostly because it used to be able to stealth fire, which made this ship quite overpowered because, well, it was invisible and still able to rain HE down on its targets. And of course, the HE on the Zao has always been its main tool. With flags and such, you can reach a pretty incredible 23% fire chance. So even though the firing arcs aren't the best, the rate of fire is probably the slowest among all the cruisers. It actually is the slowest among all the cruisers. It made it up for it by being this incessant long-range threat that basically you couldn't even fire back at. They did nerf the stealth fire though for a good reason, because it promoted really awful gameplay in general. I think the removal of stealth fire was very welcome, even though some ships might need some additional balancing now looking back at it, but that's not relevant to the tier 10 cruisers. The Zao is still very much a long-range specialist. It does have a very low HP pool at only 41k health or 40.8, but in return it's probably one of the tankiest cruisers in the game, because it has something that we'd like to refer as troll armor, or I refer to it as troll armor on my stream, meaning it's really tanky. It's able to tank a lot of incoming fire, even though it might not look like it at first glance, but this ship is very hard to citadel, especially by battleships who usually citadel other cruisers quite easily. The Zao tends to be this trollish target that refuses to get citadeled as easily. But let's start off, of course, with the obvious strengths that this ship has. First off, of course, we have the excellent concealment. 9.7 km concealment, and as I already mentioned, incredible railgun-like shells. Also, it has very hard-hitting HE. This combination, of course, means that you are able to sneak up on unsuspecting DDs and help your own DDs win fights that usually should be drawn out or hard, but when a Zao pops out like that, well, the DD kind of gets eliminated instantly. This combination of heavy hard-hitting HE and railgun-like guns, of course, means that Zao is universally strong against pretty much everything in the game. Even if you don't have AP loaded, you happen to have HE loaded and you spot the cruiser, you can still do these huge hard hits that almost always cause fires, and you can really pick any target you want and you're able to punish them. But of course, the one thing the Zao excels at is burning down battleships. It's kind of its bread and butter thing that it's always been great at. 18.8 km range, of course, 920 meter shell velocity combined with huge fire chance and these railgun-like arcs means that you're able to burn down battleships from extreme ranges. And when you're able to not just inflict this damage, but when they attempt to fire back, you have this very trollish armor that usually means that you take almost none to very little damage in return. It's pretty obvious why battleships in general tend to hate Zao the most. Zao is a very feared cruiser for battleships. The rest might not fear it. Well, honestly, everyone respects it in that sense that you might get burned down by that annoying Zao at any point, but it's mostly, of course, battleships that fear it the most, because that non-stop long-range fire, and when the AP comes in return, because you're so far away already, well, you can easily sit at long ranges because of your great shell velocity and still land hits, but when they return fire, they have to shoot so far away that you have plenty of time to maneuver and dodge. So the Zao is in general a very safe long-range specialist that is extremely hard to punish at these long ranges. If you do have a chance to use them, you do also have access to some of the most terrifying torps in the game. These torps hit for over 21k each, you can launch 10 of them per side, and they are 76 knots in speed, which means that even if you get warned, like say this Tirpitz does, and you instantly start turning away, just like this Tirpitz does, you're still likely to eat them because these torps are so stupidly fast. But of course they have multiple drawbacks in return. The firing arcs for the torps are terrible. You have to get pretty much full broadside to be able to use them, and honestly, well, that's pretty much the major drawback, and of course only 8 km range. But then again, if you get to use them, the damage is massive, and they have a very high hit percentage in general. But of course, these firing arcs bring us back to one of the fundamental issues of the ZOW, or the major drawbacks of the ZOW. First of all, the firing angles on both the torps and the guns are not the best, which mean if you really want to, if you're forced to brawl someone, you have to give them a lot of broadside, either to use all your guns or use all your torpedoes. So when it actually comes to brawling, I would say the ZOW is probably the worst tier 10 cruiser of them all, because most of the time brawling comes down to pointing a nose in against each other, angling against each other, and if you're only able to use your front guns, the combination of very slow reload and inability to actually use torpedoes means that the ZOW will usually come out as the loser unless the enemy cruiser misplays. When it comes to actual utility for the team, the ZOW also has very little besides the stealth it can use to support its DDs, as you saw in the first clip. It lacks radar. The AA on it, if you fully spec AA, you can get it quite good, but in general the default AA really isn't much to brag about, and you will unlikely to be shooting down any sort of high tier planes, even if you pop defensive AA, which I recommend, because if you don't run defensive AA, well, then you're such an easy victim for carriers to pick. So ultimately, the ZOW is quite a selfish ship to play. It has probably some of the least team utility in the entire game. Not the least. Henri IV, I think, takes the cake of being the least useful team player cruiser. The ZOW at least has its stealth to fall back on, but in general, if you end up in things like cyclones and such, the ZOW will struggle. It's absolutely a long-range specialist, and it does falter quite heavily at close ranges. Moving on from the somewhat selfish ZOW that falters at close ranges, we have the king of close range and the king of team play, which is the Des Moines. The Des Moines, unlike the ZOW, does not have that excellent shell velocity. In fact, I did mention it had a 920 meter shell velocity on both. Well, the Des Moines arcs are significantly more lazy. It also doesn't have the same 9.7 concealment, once again also worse. In return though, the Des Moines is probably one of the most team utility oriented ships in the entire game. It's a ship that shines when it gets to play in divisions. It shines when it gets to play a central role on the map, where it can just have a huge influence on everything going on around it. And in general, a central positioning Des Moines that is backed up by its team is one of the worst things for the enemy to have to face. Now, while at first glance this slow shell velocity might make you think that the Des Moines is bad at dealing with DDs, that's really not true. As long as they get somewhat close, let's say within 12 kilometers, they will struggle to survive underneath a experienced Des Moines player, because while you might have slow shells, as you can see there's this significant arc and laziness to them compared to the ZOW shells, in return you have massive firepower. Every 5.5 seconds another volley of 203mm HE is being sent out, and you're starting fires, you're breaking modules, and it's so hard for a DD to survive this because they can't really realistically avoid it, because there's only a 5-second gap between the volleys. Of course, another advantage to these slow shells is this position here. If I was a ZOW in this position, I would be hitting the island. I would have absolutely no chance of lobbing the shells over. Whereas the Des Moines can make use of these very terrain-focused positions, where it can simply hide behind islands and just lob this unending rain of fire down on the enemy. The shells, as you can see at long ranges, get extremely floaty, but that's kind of the trade-off you have to make in order to gain these other advantages. Another great advantage is of course the AA on the ship. You see that the carrier is attempting to go for a strike, a tier 10 carrier. So all I need to do is pop defensive AA and target the squads, and the first squad dies before even getting close to dropping its payload. And that's of course why the Des Moines is considered the scariest carrier counter in the entire game, because you cannot strike through this defensive AA. Another unique thing with the Des Moines and all American cruisers is the American super heavy AP that the Des Moines gets access to. This super heavy AP has excellent penetration, even though the shell velocity might make you believe otherwise, because usually it relies on shell velocity, but the plunging AP from the Des Moines is a no joke. Even if you're a battleship, like this guy finds out, even if you're a battleship, if you do expose broadside to the Des Moines, this massive AP damage combined with this fast reloading fire rate means that a battleship giving you broadside will regret it and will melt extremely quickly. So this of course means that popping out around corners like this is a huge threat to any ship, and if you do this, can do this to battleships, you of course understand what it does to broadside cruisers as well. They disappear just as easily, and it's no surprise that they're instantly turning away and fleeing, because this is not the kind of firepower you can survive under. So that is of course a huge strength, both the HE and the AP DPM that this ship can pump out. Finally, of course, we have one of the strongest tools in the game that Des Moines gets its own version of, and that is of course radar. 9.9 km range, 40-second duration. It means any sort of smoke play done within the range of the Des Moines can get heavily countered. Now this of course applies to all DDs, this applies to all Royal Navy cruisers. For this example I chose the Belfast because, well, I have a personal hatred for the Belfast because I think it's a stupid ship that should never have been released. So something that's of course very overpowered at tier 7 does not have very much fun against a ship like Des Moines. The combination of the super heavy AP combined with countering smokes, combined with having big citadels like Royal Navy cruisers have, mean that this ship is a very natural counter to them and not something you want to face if you're playing one. Now, so far based on this commentary, it might seem like the Des Moines is the ultimate cruiser in the game, but that is of course not the case. It does have its own levy of weaknesses. First of all, if you YOLO or someone YOLOs you, you only have your guns to rely on. This ship has access to no torpedoes at all, so pretty much this super heavy AP is your only tool. There's no burst damage that you can help deal with multiple targets at one, you just have to gun them down. Secondly, the speed on the ship isn't exactly impressive at 33 knots. I think, is that with the flag? Is that with a flag? No, it's without a flag. Still, the speed is of course somewhat of an issue. It's not a particularly fast cruiser, but most importantly of all is the lack of armor. If we look at the armor layout, we notice that the bow of the ship and the flat broadside above the armor belt is 27 millimeters. What this means is that most high-tier battleships can overmatch this armor, and the overmatching mechanic of course means that they can penetrate it regardless of angling. Overmatching ignores all angles, so even if you're angled like this and a battleship hits you here, he will still penetrate it because of the overmatch mechanic. What this means is that the Des Moines eats a ton more damage than many of the other cruisers. If we, for example, look at the Zan, we might notice that while it has the same 25 millimeter forend, it has 30 millimeters on the side, and this significantly impacts the tankiness of the ship. They both have a 30 millimeter deck, but this weakness along the side is one of the reasons why the Des Moines tends to eat these huge AP volleys, because it's very hard to angle against anyone with high calibers in it, because if you go bow in, well, you get shot straight through the nose into the citadel, and if you angle like this, you tend to eat these huge penetrations here, which is of course better than the citadels, but still in no way optimal. So the overall squishiness of the Des Moines is absolutely one of its drawbacks. So while you tend to shine on maps where you can use cover to your advantage, not all maps are designed like this. In fact, many of the high tier maps have very limited coverage, and on these maps the Des Moines will struggle especially if you're playing it solo without division mates to smoke and back you up. And the Des Moines will heavily struggle in this situation simply because of how much damage it does. So the Des Moines really, not just is it the best team playing ship, it's also the ship that relies the most on its teammates. So you have to keep that in mind, that while it's a great teammate, it also needs teammates. You cannot simply go solo, because if you get unlucky with the map pick, well, you're gonna have quite a hard time in this ship, especially because battleships and such, of course, know that it's very squishy and people enjoy and they know it's a huge threat as well. And all the DDs will call target on you because they fear the radar. The carriers will request that they kill the Des Moines because they fear the anti-air. So you will get focused a lot, and the ship really can't deal with that focus very well at all. Now, since we just covered the Des Moines, let's move on to the second radar cruiser. Now, I did mention that the Moines suffered from being focused at. Well, the Moskva is pretty much the exact opposite. I mentioned the Zhao had 40.8k health and the Des Moines had 50.6. The Moskva sits at a pretty damn staggering 65.4k health, meaning it is by far the tankiest tier 10 cruiser. It also has a surprising amount of torpedo protection at 28%. And, well, if we compare the armor that we mentioned earlier, well, unlike the Des Moines that suffered from 27mm broadside armor, the Moskva has 50mm. Not to mention the broadside belt actually extends far higher on the broadside, which means that you have a ton of armor protecting not your sides, but even the deck armor is 50mm, which means that not only will you be bouncing AP, including Yamato AP, you can also shatter a large amount of the HE being shot your way. However, the Moskva does share many of the weaknesses that the other cruisers do, in the sense that the bow armor is only 25mm, which means if you give nose in to even a Bismarck, which is 380mm, he can overmatch your nose and citadel you from the front. So of course angling is absolutely a key tool in this ship. Now, that doesn't mean that this ship is simply a tankier Des Moines. That would be oversimplifying things quite a lot. In fact, if we look at the AA, we notice that, well, it loses a great amount of DPS on all the auras. While you can spec into AA and make it fairly strong, if Des Moines fully spec to AA will still completely outshine you. And so it cannot simply match the same numbers. It does get some great range on the auras though at 8.2, which means that it can cause a very large panic radius with the defensive AA. Another big drawback is the Des Moines, which sat at 10.6 concealment. Well, the Moskva sits at 13.8. And this is of course with the stealth build, which I run on all my cruisers. Why this is important is because battleships can actually get better concealment. Tier 10 battleships, including the Grosse Kurfürst, can get better concealment than this. So while you might be a very, very tanky cruiser, you are literally being outspotted by ships that can one-shot you. So that is a very important thing to keep in mind. But it does have some things that make it shine in its own right. One of the biggest things that it of course has is the guns. Both the AP and the HE are extremely scary, but especially the AP. While the Des Moines has a better reload at 5.5 and the Moskva with reload I think is 9.1, in return it has absolutely terrifying shell velocity at 985 meters per second. And this of course makes it even faster than Zhao shells. And it also has great range at 19.4 km, meaning it is kind of like a pocket battleship. You do not want to be giving broadside at this at any range. You can see these huge long range volleys able to punish any cruiser that gets caught within its range giving broadside. And this of course makes it very, very scary for, well, every type of ship, because if you get broadside to the Moskva, you will get punished. If you're a cruiser, you will get citadeled hard. And this type of play, especially if there's somewhat of an island cover, which means you're undetected like I am here, means that you're never really safe as a cruiser against this thing, and it makes it very scary to play against. And a good Moskva, an accurate Moskva player, well, it can punish any tier 10 cruiser that gives it broadside. It doesn't matter. Even tier 10 battleships can get citadeled if the Moskva gets close enough. And it's just one big citadel fiesta, and Moskva AP is absolutely one of the scariest things to face in the entire game. And well, especially for cruisers. Even DDs though fear, because the HE is just as fast, and because the HE is so fast, the hit percentage is very, very high. So when it comes to gun power, it's really hard to match the Moskva at long range. The Tsar might be a specialist at burning ships down, but Moskva is a specialist at punishing people at max range. When it comes to brawling capacity, the Moskva and the Des Moines kinda switch places in a sense that whereas the Des Moines has a great amount of damage with the great reload and the great auto-bounce angles, or auto-penetration angles, so to say, the Moskva in return, well, if someone angles against you, you might struggle to actually do too much damage with your AP, and in general, of course, your slower reload means that, well, you're up shit creek without a paddle, and you have no torpedoes to fall back on either. You can see almost no damage. However, if they do give you broadside, or if you manage to sail into a position that you get broadside, the damage is significant because of how good the penetration is, and you are able to citadel most battleships, if they don't have turtleback, that is. But in return, of course, you have much better armor. You're able to tank volleys that would probably destroy the Des Moines. As long as you take them on that tanky broadside, you're able to endure volleys that would easily destroy the squishier cruiser. You saw that volley, no issues tanking a tier 10 Große Kurfürst at this distance. Now, this is kind of what I meant, that they trade positions. In close range, Moskva is much tankier, but not quite as deadly, whereas the Des Moines is much deadlier, but doesn't have nearly as much survivability. You note, by the way, that volley on the Hindenburg, right down at the waterline, and nothing but over penetrations. Well, that's going to be the next ship which we cover, because the Hindenburg does have this quite hilarious troll armor that makes it extremely hard to citadel. But first, let's wrap up the Moskva. The Moskva, just like the Des Moines, of course, has access to radar. And in the past, they kind of had a bit of a trade-off going on. The Des Moines had significantly longer duration at 40 seconds, whereas Moskva only had a 25-second duration. In return, though, the Moskva radar range was 11.7, so you had more range in return for less duration. However, recently you were able to slot this radar upgrade in the same slot as some of the more useful upgrades. And this of course means that you are able to increase the duration of radar by 40%. So instead of being a 25-second radar against the Des Moines 40, you are actually able to extend it to 35 seconds. And a 35-second radar at 11.7 means that the Moskva is terrifying for any sort of ship that relies on concealment, whether that be DDs that rely on just not being seen, or Royal Navy cruisers that rely on not or being smoked up. Of course, I doubt I have to explain to you what it means to have this amazing AP that I demonstrated against targets earlier in this vid, combined with long-range radar. The Moskva straight up shits on Royal Navy cruisers. It's not even a close competition. All you have to do is find a smoke, pop your radar, and then you basically get 10 citadels on them, well, 9 citadels on them, and devastating strike them instantly. The Moskva hard counters Royal Navy cruisers to a pretty ridiculous extent. The incredible armor on it, of course, also means that if you angle against Royal Navy cruisers, they do very little damage. All they can do is deplete your superstructure health, and after that they really aren't doing much, and they will rely on torpedoes or you being dumb enough to give them broadside. So the Moskva is kind of like a battleship, but it does have some great tools, like the incredible guns, the great radar, but it does trade it off by having absolutely no torpedoes, not having any concealment whatsoever, making it very tough to sneak up on people. But I feel it is less team reliant than the Des Moines, simply because it's significantly tankier, and it has this massive range advantage as well. So the Moskva is certainly a very strong ship, but Is it the best at everything? No, not really, because let's just say that if you happen to brawl into a Hindenburg, well, the Moskva will not have a very good time in that fight at all. Now we're finally reaching what I consider probably one of my favorite cruisers in the game, which is the Hindenburg. Now the Hindenburg isn't really the best at anything, but it's really not the worst at anything either. The Hindenburg is the definition of a jack-of-all-trades kind of ship, although one could argue that it's probably among the best at brawling. And of course, the fact is that just like all German ships, it has incredibly strong AP with quite weak HE. And of course the Hindenburg having 12 guns with very fast reload means that if you get access to any sort of broadsides, well, you can deal a lot of punishment to them. Now, while the Hindenburg has a very respectable shell velocity of 925 meters per second, the shells are quite light. So you see, while when they get broadside, you can be extremely punishing with this AP, but you are very limited to flat broadsides. As soon as there's any sort of angling involved, your AP loses almost all of its strength. And the shells in general are quite slow. Sorry, not slow, quite light. So even though you have great shell velocity, the further away you are, the floatier they become, because, well, they lose a lot of penetration, they lose a lot of velocity at ranges. However, Wargaming has fairly recently introduced or increased the penetration of your HE shells, so the HE in general is quite a consistent tool. Your fire chance is okay, mostly because your rate of fire is so damn good. The HE itself won't deal any sort of massive alpha damage, but the fire chance is okay, and it's a good consistent tool or a consistent source of damage while you basically wait for your HE or your AP to get a broadside to fire at. In general though, I've outfitted my Hindenburg for faster reload, because the Hindenburg is not really a long-range specialist like many of the other cruisers. It's more of a mid to close range type of deal. In fact, if we look at the general stats of the Hinden, we note that the concealment, well, it's not as bad as the Moskva's, but it's not really that good either. The maneuverability, it's pretty slow, it's not the best maneuverability. The AA is actually quite good, and very, in general, quite strong. You can slot the specialized German hydroacoustic search on this. German hydro in this game is slightly better than the normal hydro, giving you longer range on it, or well, not slightly better, a lot better. And running hydro is an option, but since I prefer to play this ship as more of a jack of all trades kind of deal, I like having my defensive AA as a tool to not just defend myself but to help my team out as well. Because if you do run hydro, then because of course of the rather large turning circle and the rather slow speed, you become a surprisingly easy target for carriers to focus. So I do like having my defensive AA for that purpose. I think, in fact, what I should do is run spotter plane on this ship for that additional range, smoke firing, and in general, because the fighter plane is quite useless most of the time. Regardless though, the ship, while it might seem kind of average, it does have some very strong or special things. First of all, the torps. You have 8 torps per side, and what's special is that the firing arcs on these torps are actually quite good, which help you brawl far better than you normally would. The range is only 6 km, and the damage isn't the most impressive, but the fact that you have so many on both sides, it really helps complement your brawling capacity. Your health pool, 52k, fairly tanky, but that's not really the whole story about the tankiness of the Hindenburg. Now I think I need to show you guys the armor layout to give you an example. Let's get rid of the outer layer of armor. Now, while you got the usual 30mm here and the bow is 27, the pretty much usual cruiser stuff here, what's important to note is that you notice there's a turtleback. This kind of armor around is a turtleback surrounding the citadel. What this means is flat arcs close range or at medium range will usually get absorbed by the turtleback. Now at long range you can citadel the ship quite easily, but if you remove the turtleback, you see that the citadel is actually extremely angled and very, very low in the water. What this means is, well, honestly, I should probably demonstrate it to you, because why take my word for it when I can just provide you with exact proof instead. So, in this training clip, I've set up a bunch of Hindenburgs for me. You might notice I'm shooting from outside of 6 kilometers. Right here, we have a Hindenburg full broadside to us, and at this range of a bit more than 6 kilometers, or around 6 kilometers, especially on a Montana that has a fair amount of plunging fire, you note that we have absolutely no issues citadeling this Hindenburg. The shells plunge through the sky and they punch through the broadside, and then because of the angle they have, they are able to punch through the citadel as well. So, okay, you're not really seeing what's the big deal then. Well, the thing that makes the Hindenburg an especially frustrating target to brawl against at extreme close ranges is the fact that when we get even closer, suddenly the citadels disappear. You can no longer get them. You get penetrations, which means you pin the outer armor, but you're not pinning the citadel anymore because of the angle of the extreme angle of the citadel. And this repeats itself when you get closer from this point. I can give you one more example to show that it's not just a fluke, but I'm not going to drag it out further than this. But we have full flat broadside right under the smokestack where we know the citadel is, and give it a full volley from the broadside, and nothing but pins and over pins. Now this is the only cruiser in the game that actually has this rather unique quirk going for it. So if we move on to the actual model now, you can see this extreme angle of this armored deck slope. And this of course means that this is really the only cruiser that can easily get away with showing full broadside and actually using these torpedoes against other cruisers without being punished by citadels in return. So that's of course one of the things that makes the Hindenburg a really frustrating target to brawl against, because if any other cruiser does this, you will punish him with citadels. If the Hindenburg does this, well, you get a bunch of damage, sure, but he's not gonna die from it, especially not with 52k health. Now, of course, what is all this theory without a gameplay example? You briefly saw the great torpedo angles, and now of course you see what happens if a battleship gives you broadside at close ranges and you actually get to use this AP. The damage output is straight up terrifying, especially with the reload mod. It's these constant 10 to 12k, or well, 9 to 12k volleys of AP every 8.8 seconds. If you have taken damage, of course, AR will be kicking in, so we're reloading even faster. And any sort of ship being put into this situation, well, it kind of just disappears. And, well, the torpedoes, the ability to launch torpedoes on both sides with these great firing angles is, of course, fantastic. And even then, you kind of don't need the extreme torpedo firing angles, because you can get away with the broadside. Oh, Za got full broadside jump on us. Did you notice that all he got was overpens? The Sao, of course, has great railguns, and he got to shoot full flat broadside on us. What happened? He overpenned. I shot him back. What happened? He got citadeled to pieces. I'm giving broadside to the Montana, to the North Carolina. Are any of them getting any citadels on me? Well, I'm taking damage, sure, but I'm not really dying, am I? They do a lot of damage to me, but they are unable to kill me. So this really, a cyclone in general, or any kind of brawling situation, is absolutely incredible for the Hinden. Of course, if you angle the way I do, so you don't get to take the shells on your nose, but on your broadside, angle like this, of course, you're also quite tanky and able to take a lot of these hits without taking any damage, which is of course preferable to taking heavy damage but not taking a citadel. So this kind of situation is exactly the type of situation where the Hindenburg shines, when you can just bring all your firepower and all your strengths to bear. And a Hindenburg in a brawl is probably one of the most terrifying things that I know. Now let's move on from one extreme to the other. While giving broadside in the Hindenburg at close ranges might let you get away with it, here's a ship that will never let you get away with it, the Minotaur. In fact, just to show you guys the sheer size of the citadel on this thing, to give you some sort of idea, all this area here, this is citadel. So this is a lot to shoot at. The Minotaur is probably one of the squishiest ships in the game. Well, like even lower tier Royal Navy cruisers have less citadel showing. It's mostly tier 9 and tier 10 that have this obscene amount of citadel. Although, to be fair, if we do enable the armor, we might see that the bow armor is enough to bounce most of the other cruisers, meaning if you do angle against other cruisers, you can get away with it. Now, the Royal Navy cruisers are a bit special in the sense that they don't only have access to AP, they have no access to HE at all, and they have quite slow shells with not too much range at all at 15.8. Even at 15.8 you will really struggle to hit anything. But they have excellent torps, they have the best heal in the game, and they have excellent concealment, and most importantly of all, of course, they have access to their own smoke screen, which means that, well, you are able to surprise enemies or just remain undetected most of the time. Unlike some of the other ships who might rely on tricks like the Hindenburg, or armor angling like the Moskva, or positioning like the Moines, the Minotaur relies almost entirely on not being seen when it comes to survival. Now, the Minotaur playstyle focuses heavily on supporting your DDs and in general playing quite close to the enemy. The reason for this is, of course, you have very good tools to counter DDs. You have your own hydroacoustic search, which will warn you about any incoming torpedoes. You have fairly good stealth, which allows you to get very close in general without even being spotted. And of course you have your torpedoes. If they do smoke up, you can punish smoked up enemy DDs quite easily because, well, your torps are fantastic. They have such, not only do they deal 17k each, but you can launch 8 per side, and they have 10 kilometers of range, which is actually further than your own concealment. So technically you can actually stealth torpedo in this ship without too many issues. So in general, the playstyle very much relies on pushing into a cap with your DDs. Either a DD smokes you up, like my division mate did here, or you smoke yourself up, and then you harass, you torpedo any smoked up DDs, any DDs running away, you shoot at and punish, and you pick on any broadsides, or in general any targets you see. Now, you can see that shells are extremely floating. The DD I talked earlier got caught in the smoke and ate a torpedo, and because of the damage plus flooding he does get killed. And as you can see, the rate of fire kind of compensates for the fact that your arcs are so very lazy, and the fact that you can only really shoot AP. So at first glance it might seem weak to only fire AP, but the damage potential of this AP is just terrifying. If any DD does wander into your territory, well, they will quickly regret it, because the AP is special in the sense that it has a very short fuse, meaning it arms even while shooting squishy broadsides. While other cruisers would get overpens, your AP arms and deals full damage, which, as you can see, deals with them extremely quickly. Also, of course, this threat of AP makes you quite tough to brawl against as another cruiser. Even as a Hindenburg, it makes you quite tough to brawl against. The reason for this is, though, because if you get broadside, even if you don't get citadel, the sheer amount of damage that the ship can pump out means that it's a very scary threat to give broadside to. So you kind of try to push nose in against the Minotaur. The problem is, if the Minotaur pushes nose in as well, not many cruisers can really do too much about it. For example, a Zao versus Minotaur fight is heavily skewed in the Minotaur's favor. Not only could I launch my left side torps, you see I'm bouncing his AP without any issues, so he kind of has to use front guns HE. Like this fight is so heavily skewed in my favor. Usually fights like this get decided by other people interfering and the Minotaur just exploding because it's squishy. But if you do have the chance to do this, well, you see the torpedo angles. Launch first volley, but I save the other one in case he tries to do something. If he tries to give broadside, well, he'll eat a ton of damage, so he can't do that. He has to stay angled. He dodges the first torps. Now he's gotten real close, but there's still more of these torps, and they're so fast, 62 knots, and they deal so much damage that the Zao never really had any chance in this fight. So Minotaur against other cruisers is actually quite strong, except of course if there's radar and he gets caught broadside and all of these situations. So it's not like the ship is in any way unbeatable. But the ship itself, I mean, it's fun, it's quite strong, but it can get kind of repeaty or kind of samey, the playstyle. In general, I haven't played my Minotaur too much because I find the gameplay is quite one-dimensional. I do have to note though that this is, I think, the only cruiser in the game that can't even slot defensive AA. No, you can't slot defensive AA at all. But in return though, it has some of the best base anti-air in the game. So you don't really need defensive AA because Minotaurs are plain shredders. Not just because of the huge range and huge damage on this anti-air, but because you also tend to sit in smokes and be undetected, so the carrier doesn't have much of a warning before it's already losing planes. So the Minotaur is a very strong ship, and it has its situations where it shines very, very well, but against good Moskva players or possibly even good Des Moines players, the Minotaur can be quite tricky to make work. And there's also, of course, the fact that I have made multiple guides on how to shoot ships in smoke, and that's of course also extremely strong against the Minotaur, because once again, because of this massive citadel, any sort of hits in the smoke with battleship AP have a very high chance of citadeling the ship. In fact, devastating strikes on smoked up Minotaurs isn't something entirely uncommon at all. So you have to keep that in mind when you try to play this ship, that there are multiple ways to counter it. Finally, of course, we have the Henri or Henri IV, which is probably the single most selfish cruiser in the game. Now, first of all, well, let's go over the strengths of this ship. The health pool, let's see, the health pool is pretty good, almost pretty much very close to the Hindenburg, and the gun range at 19.1 is very good, and honestly the HE and AP on this ship are very, very good. The HE has an excellent chance of fire, and the AP has almost as much penetration as the Moskva. The issue is, of course, that the shell velocity is significantly slower at 845, which means that it's not really as reliable at landing shells as the Moskva is. The concealment is quite terrible at 12.7 and 8.7 air detectability, so you get spotted miles away. The AA is okay. With defensive AA up, with the defensive AA consumable in use, I would even say the AA is pretty good. You can defend against strikes, but if your defensive AA is not active, especially later in the game when you've taken some damage, your AA tends to struggle quite a lot. The torps are okay, they're not really much special. I mean, you have torps at least. You got 3 on each side, they deal 15k each, 9k in range, which is really the strongest part of it. And it does have a bit of a unique armor scheme in the sense that it has something called spaced armor. Now, it might be quite tricky to see, like in the default setting it's quite hard to see this spaced armor, because all you see is torpedo bulge, and then if you take off the torpedo bulge, then all you see is the citadel, which is 45, so you might get fooled into thinking that the ship has this little armor, but that's not actually the case. You have to get rid of all the stuff on top, and you have to turn on the outer plating layer, and then, well, it's easier to see if you turn off the citadel, and then you can see on the inside here you actually have another layer of armor protecting your citadel. What does this mean, this layered armor? Or what it means is that cruisers actually have quite a hard time of citadeling this ship. I've struggled quite a lot to citadel the Henri and other cruisers, simply because you tend to penetrate the outer layer, but then you get stopped by the citadel itself. You get penetration damage, but you do not get that citadel damage. Battleships, however, have quite an easy time of citadeling, because they have enough penetrative power to overcome this strength. Now, the strength of the Henri is absolutely the speed. It has access to this special speed boost, which lasts 3 minutes, and of course I highly recommend you slot the module engine boost mod, which increases this by 50%. This is of course especially strong on the French cruisers, and it boosts this boost to 4.5 minutes. And while this boost is active, you are by far the fastest cruiser in the game. Already without it, you are very fast, but with this speed boost active, you are blazingly fast. In fact, it's worth noting that you are even faster than torpedoes dropped by carriers, which means that you can outrun these torps that do about 39-40 knots. You can easily outrun them in the Henri. So if someone drops from behind you, just keep sailing away and you will outrun it.
The problems that the Henry really has is that it's a very selfish ship. Speed boost is great for one person, you alone. It does not benefit the team in any way. You do not have the concealment to sneak up close like the Za does. You don't have smoke or hydro to help your team like the Minotaur does, or like you can't help your DDs in the same way. You don't have any radar like the Moines or the Moskva has, and you don't really brawl nearly as well as, for example, the Hindenburg does. That's not to say the ship is necessarily that bad of a brawler. If you do get close, it's quite strong. I mean, the armor isn't that special in general, but if you get close enough that you can bring this heavy, hard-hitting AP to bear, you can do a lot of damage. But in general, this ship is the best at just simply running away and just spamming HE from afar or AP from afar. In fact, one of the more unfavorable comparisons people make is comparing the Henry to the Moskva, where the Moskva has significantly better armor and of course has access to radar, which is such a huge tool, and it has faster shells, and while the Henry's a really good damage farmer, it doesn't seem to have really the carrying power of something like a Moskva does in the games. But of course we can jump into an example for this ship. If you do, of course, happen to brawl another cruiser, closing the distance to try to use your torps is always a good idea. And well, I recommend in general keeping AP loaded, because if they do decide to give you broadside, the punishment you can dish out is extreme, and you can aim for their guns and try to disable them as you close the distance. This St. Louis makes the mistake of giving us broadside, and against a ship like the Henry, that's a very large mistake, and you get an instant devastating strike. And that's not really uncommon. If you get broadside cruisers, if you catch broadside cruisers, the massive AP damage this ship does, I think it's 6.2k per citadel, means that you can deal a ton of damage to them. Now, this game example is pretty interesting in the sense that this was a very close game. You can see the time is ticking out, and the enemy carrier is going to try to kill me, and he only has one torpedo bomber left in each. It's a tier 10 carrier, so of course these planes are quite hard to kill. And you can see kind of how the Henry struggles towards the late of the game, especially when you've taken some damage that has knocked out parts of your AA, and how you struggle to shoot down the planes if defensive AA isn't active. These are only 2 planes, and simply incapable of shooting them down. But of course the Henry has the speed. In fact, if you look at the bottom left, you can see the speed I'm building up to here is pretty damn insane. I'm sailing away from the planes to give my AA more time to work. But when he does drop these torps, because of the speed of the ship, you can do some pretty interesting torpedo beats that not many other cruisers could get away with. And managed to dodge both of these torps. The bomber does hit me, doesn't matter. I can prepare that fire. Not that I actually need to, because the game is about to end, and this of course game ends in a victory. But the Henry is... I actually don't mind playing it too much. I think it's a pretty okay, fun ship. But when it comes to playing in a division, it's probably the single most useless cruiser you can pick up. And when it comes to influencing the win for a game, unless you manage to have like these huge monster games, unless you manage to have this great monster game that just you deal way over 200k damage and you just devastate a lot of targets, it's quite hard to influence the win rate or influence the outcome of the game, because you can't really sneak up close to the caps, not with this concealment, and mostly you rely on your team to do well enough to survive long enough that you are able to carry the ship, or able to carry the game in this ship. And that's quite hard to do, because you don't have any direct tools to influence. In a Minotaur you can quickly take over a cap, kill some DDs, Des Moines, Moskva can radar it. Like, you have these other ships have these different tools to be able to influence the outcome of the game from the first moment, whereas the Henry has to wait, and not until the mid game will your influence like start to be noticed. Towards the late game your influence will start to be quite big because of all the damage you have accumulated. But when it comes to early game impact, it's very, very low, and that's a problem because many of the World of Warships games are actually decided in the very early game. Who gets the caps, who gets the map control, who gets the early DD kills and such things. So even though my win rate, I think my win rate is quite good in this, let's actually check it so I'm not talking complete nonsense. I will note that I have felt like I have been a lot more reliant on my team than I've been in any other. Let's see if we can find, where is my, it's not one of my, it's probably my least, it's the newest tier 10 cruiser, but it's also my least played because of these issues. 46 games, 130k average damage, 74% damage, 74% win rate, so it's not like I have a bad win rate in it, but you must keep in mind that this ship, in order to be effective in this ship, you have to rely a lot on your team, which is not something a lot of people will enjoy doing, especially in a game like World of Warships. Anyway, that was my, oh my god, this vid turned out to be absolutely gigantic. That was my tier 10 cruiser comparison. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm gonna end it now, so my processing, or basically so the processing doesn't take the entire day. I will talk to you guys later. I hope you enjoyed it.